My name is Celeste Okafor. I'm 29 years old. And the evening my mother held up my fabric sample, dropped it on the kitchen table, and said, "Nobody in this family has ever wasted money like this." That was the evening I finally understood that some people's doubt is a room you are not required to explain yourself out of. My mother let the cloth fall from about 8 inches up. My aunt said, "Let her fail. Then she'll listen." I folded the fabric, placed it back in the box, and said I had a long drive. What none of them knew was that 3 weeks earlier, a senior buyer at a Paris textile showcase had emailed to request samples, and that the request had come not from a cold inquiry but from a recommendation made by someone who had placed her hand on my cloth and immediately understood what she was touching. But that part came later. To understand the fabric line, you have to understand the 10 years before it. I grew up watching my mother sew, not as a pastime, as necessity. She altered school uniforms, hemmed trousers for neighbors, repatched the things our family could not replace and would not throw away. The industrial machine she used sat in the corner of the kitchen, a second-hand Singer model she had bought at an estate sale for less than the cost of a week's groceries, and I had learned to thread it by age 9 because she needed the extra hands. I understood tension settings before I understood percentages. I could read the way a seam puckered and know within 2 adjustments what had caused it. What I did not know for most of my adolescence and all of my early 20s was that this was a form of education. My mother did not frame it that way. She framed it as survival, the practical skill of a woman who had learned early that the world would not always have what she needed in the size or quality or price point she required, and that the ability to make and repair was therefore not a craft but a hedge. I absorbed the skill and absorbed the framing simultaneously, which meant that for years I carried a kind of competence I didn't fully credit. I went to a state college on a partial scholarship and studied business administration, which was the degree my mother pointed to when I asked. It was a practical degree in a practical direction, and it led, predictably, to a practical job, purchasing coordinator at a mid-sized import company, starting at 22, where I spent 3 years learning how supply chains worked, how material sourcing decisions were made at scale, and how the distance between a factory floor in one country and a finished garment on a rack in another was almost entirely a question of relationships, timing, and tolerance for inconsistency. The job paid adequately. It also made me restless in a way that took me a while to locate precisely. The restlessness was this. Every fabric I handled at the import company was sourced from a small pool of high-volume suppliers, all producing for consistency, none of them making anything I would have chosen to touch if choice had been part of the transaction. The textiles that moved fastest were the ones that felt the least, smooth in a way that meant nothing, uniform in a way that had no variation, engineered for the middle of every chart. I understood why the industry worked that way. I also understood, in the particular way you understand something that has been sitting unexamined in the back of your mind since childhood, that it did not have to. At 25, I gave notice. My mother asked, twice, whether I was certain. I told her I was. She said she would pray for me, which was genuine and also her way of saying that she had done what she could, and the rest was now my problem. My aunt, who had strong opinions about most decisions and particularly strong opinions about decisions made by women under 30, told me at a family gathering that same month that leaving a salaried position without another salaried position waiting was something people did in movies and regretted in life. I thanked her. I went home and looked at studio rental listings. The first year after leaving the import company was the hardest one, which is not a surprising thing to say, but is worth saying precisely. I worked part-time as a floor supervisor at a fabric wholesaler 3 days a week, which covered rent and utilities and left me tired enough on some evenings that I sat on the studio floor eating crackers for dinner rather than going home first. The remaining 4 days I spent in the studio, a rented space in a converted warehouse district, 14 feet wide and 20 feet long, with a single north-facing window, a radiator that made a rhythmic ticking sound for the first 2 hours of every morning, and a loom I had bought used from a weaver, who was closing her practice and needed the space back for her grandchildren. The loom was functional but had been maintained inconsistently and required 2 weeks of adjustment before I trusted it with anything I intended to keep. I did not tell my parents how the year was going, in specific terms. I told my mother I was working. She asked whether I was eating properly, which was the question she asked when she did not have another question that fit. I said yes. I bought a bag of rice and photographed it and sent her the photograph, which made her laugh. We did not talk about the studio, or the loom, or the notebook page on the wall. The more specific I tried to be about what I was doing, the more the words flattened it into something that sounded like a hobby, and I had spent enough time around my family to understand that hobby and waste were nearly synonymous in their vocabulary. So, I kept the specifics in the studio and brought only the outlines home. The supply budget for the first year was tracked on a notebook page I taped to the wall beside the loom. Every fiber purchase, every tool acquisition, every failed sample that had to be written off, I recorded it the way I had learned to track supply chain costs at the import company because I had seen what happened when people in that industry stopped counting. What I was working on technically was a fiber blend behavior problem that I had first noticed at the import company and had not been able to stop thinking about since. The problem was this: a cotton linen composite, woven at a thread count high enough to produce a refined surface, almost always sacrificed the dimensional quality that made linen worth using in the first place. The standard commercial solution was to increase the cotton ratio until the linen's behavior was effectively neutralized. The fabric that resulted was cooperative and forgettable. I wanted to keep the linen present. I wanted its weight, its particular way of holding a fold without becoming rigid, its tendency to soften with use rather than pill. I wanted those properties intact in a cloth that could also be produced consistently, at a thread count that would satisfy a fashion buyer rather than a hand weaver, with shrinkage behavior predictable enough that a pattern maker could rely on it. This took 14 months to solve. The solution, when it arrived, was not a single insight but an accumulation, the kind that happens when you have been making small corrections for long enough that one of them turns out to address a problem you had not consciously named yet. The specific correction that mattered was a modified weft tension protocol I had developed while troubleshooting a different problem entirely, combined with a pre-finishing step that aligned the fiber orientation at the surface without compressing it. The resulting cloth had a quality I had not encountered in any commercial sample I had handled. It had weight without stiffness, and when you moved it, it held its shape while also moving with you, the way very good cloth does, and most cloth doesn't. I made 12 meters over 3 weeks. I hung 2 lengths from the ceiling of the studio and stood in the room with them for 2 days, doing other tasks, letting the fact of what they were settle before I tried to name it. The woman who helped me name it was Petra Lindqvist. Petra was a textile consultant and educator who ran workshops out of a studio 3 doors down in the same warehouse building. She was in her late 50s, had worked in the European fabric industry for 2 decades before relocating, and had the particular professional clarity of someone who has spent long enough in one field that they have stopped being impressed by most things it produces and become very specific about the things that still interest them. I had met her at a building-wide open studio event 6 months earlier. We had spoken briefly about fiber sourcing, and she had mentioned that she occasionally brought independent work to the attention of European buyers she had relationships with. I had filed this away without following up, because at that point I had nothing ready to show. When I had the 12 meters, I thought of her. I brought 2 of them to her studio on a Thursday morning, folded in a cotton carrier, and set them on her work table without saying anything. She ran her hand across the surface 3 times, the kind of deliberate handling that is different from touching, where each pass is gathering information rather than confirming a first impression. She held the cloth up to the light from the north window. She folded it along the grain, pressed the fold with 2 fingers, released it, and watched the fabric recover. She said, "Where did you source the fiber blend?" I told her I had developed the blend. She looked at me, not with surprise, exactly, more with the recalibration of someone adjusting an initial estimate. She said, "I'm going to send photographs to someone. Is that acceptable?" I said yes. The someone was Aurélie Marché, a senior buyer at Premier Vision, one of the most significant biannual textile showcases in the international fashion industry, held in Paris, where mills, independent developers, and buyers from major fashion houses review materials for the coming season. Premier Vision is not a venue that independent developers typically reach without industry relationships. The submissions process is structured to favor established suppliers. The independent developer section exists, but placement in it is competitive and curated. I knew about Premier Vision from the import company. I had sourced reference materials from brands that presented there. I had never attended. Petra had relationships at the showcase that went back 15 years. Aurélie Marché was one of them. 3 weeks after Petra sent the photographs, Aurélie emailed to request samples. The email was 2 paragraphs, in English, professional and specific. She asked for 4 half-meter swatches in different colorways if available, the full material specification sheet, and a note on production capacity. She named a date by which she needed them. I packaged the swatches in a flat white box. I printed a single card with the fiber specifications, the weight per square meter, the thread count, the finishing process, and my contact details. I shipped the package to Paris the following Monday. I did not tell anyone. The package arrived in Paris in October. The Saturday in November, when I drove to my parents' house with the documentation binder and the sample box, the evening my mother dropped the cloth on the table, was 3 weeks after that shipping date. I had not yet heard back from Aurélie. I did not mention Paris to my family because there was nothing confirmed to mention, and because I had learned over the previous 2 years of working in the studio that unconfirmed possibilities require a specific kind of silence. You protect them not because you are secretive, but because premature explanation does something to the air around a thing before it is real. What I brought to show my family was the documentation, the material specifications, the development log, the production cost analysis I had built using sourcing contacts from the import job, the initial pricing model for a small batch run. It was the right thing to have, and the wrong thing to present to people without the framework to read it. My mother spent approximately 40 seconds with the binder. My aunt spent fewer. My mother picked up the sample, held it, and let it fall from 8 inches. Nobody in this family has ever wasted money like this. My aunt, quietly, to my mother rather than to me, let her fail. Then she'll listen. I folded the cloth. I said I had a long drive. I loaded the box into my car while it was still light and drove home through the dark. I heard from Aurélie Marché 6 weeks after shipping the samples, in the second week of January. She wrote that the swatches had been reviewed by her team and shared with 2 fashion house buyers who had attended the previous February showcase. One buyer had expressed strong interest in a supply conversation. She asked whether I would be willing to present at the upcoming February edition of Premier Vision in the independent developer section, and said that if I confirmed, she would arrange the booth allocation directly. I read the email twice. Then I called Petra. Petra said, she sent me a note as well. You should go, Celeste. The travel, booth preparation, and sample production for Paris were going to exceed what I had in reserve. I spent the following week restructuring my development budget, identifying 3 expenditures I could defer, and applying for a creative industries grant through a regional fund I had qualified for, but not yet pursued. The grant was awarded at $7,800, which arrived 11 days before my departure. I did not tell my family about the Paris trip. I told my mother I had a work event out of the country. She asked if I would be safe. I said yes. Premier Vision in February occupied a convention complex on the periphery of the city, a spread of connected halls that, once you were inside, felt less like a trade event and more like a city organized entirely around the question of what cloth could be. The independent developer section was on the 2nd floor, behind glass doors that gave it a simultaneously prominent and separate quality, visible from the main hall but requiring a deliberate choice to enter. My booth was 4 meters across. I arrived at setup the morning before the public opening and spent 4 hours arranging the hanging samples, organizing the swatch work table by weight and finish progression, and placing the lookbook, 16 matte laminated pages, no photography, specifications and process description only, at the front corner of the table where a buyer approaching from either direction would see it first. Petra had helped me produce the lookbook in the 2 weeks before the trip. She had looked at my first draft, which was dense and technical, and said, "The buyers who will care about this are not going to need the technical density to believe you. They're going to need to believe that you understand what you made." The revised version was half as long and said twice as much. The first day was measured. 3 buyers came to the booth. 2 took cards. 1 took 2 swatches and asked about minimum order volumes, which I answered with the figures I had calculated, a minimum run of 40 meters per colorway, 4-week lead time from confirmed order. The second day changed the shape of everything. Aurélie Marché arrived at the booth at 11 in the morning. With her was a woman I did not recognize, late 40s, dark frames, wearing a coat that moved the way cloth moves when it has been chosen rather than assigned. The woman walked directly to the hanging samples without acknowledging me. She touched the first one. She touched the second. She held the fold of the third in both hands and released it, watching the cloth settle. She said something to Aurélie in French. Aurélie said to me, "She says it does what she thought it would." The woman was Sylvie Bertrand, head of fabric development at a French fashion house, with collections sold in 43 countries. She and I spoke for 45 minutes, first through Aurélie's translation, then in slower English as Sylvie found her footing in the language. She asked about fiber sourcing, about production capacity at my current studio, about the possibility of scaling the modified finishing process to larger run volumes without losing the surface quality, and about timeline flexibility for seasonal delivery windows. Every question was technical and specific. I answered each one precisely, and at the 3 points where I had not yet resolved the production scaling question, I said so. Sylvie's expression across those 45 minutes did not change significantly, which I had learned to read from the import company as a buyer who had already made a decision and was conducting the conversation to confirm it rather than reach it. When she finished, she said she would like to begin discussions about a supply arrangement for her house's autumn-winter collection. I said I would need to review her volume requirements against my current capacity and would respond within 2 weeks. She nodded. She lifted one of the hanging samples from the display rail and passed it to her assistant, without asking. I watched this happen and said nothing. It was a claim of ownership before a contract existed, which was forward, and it was also, in the particular language of that industry, a signal of serious intent. The recognition ceremony was on the showcase's closing afternoon, a brief program in a side hall, roughly 200 people, buyers and developers, and a few press, with a moderator from the showcase organization and a list of 8 names. Aurélie had told me the previous evening that my work had been submitted to the independent developer recognition process. She had said it matter-of-factly, the way you say something when the outcome has already been decided and you are simply informing rather than preparing. I had thanked her. I had not told anyone. The hall was narrow and full. I stood near the back, next to a column, where I could see the moderator at the front without being visible from the entrance. He read the names in no particular order. Mine was 5th. He described the material development briefly, the cotton linen composite, the modified finishing process, the tactile quality the swatches had demonstrated. He mentioned that preliminary supply discussions had been initiated with a fashion house. He did not name Sylvie's house, which was standard. Discussions are not contracts, and the showcase was not in the business of announcing business. The room responded with the particular applause of professionals who know what the thing being recognized costs to produce. Not celebratory, exactly. More like acknowledgement, the sound of people who have been in rooms like this long enough to understand that the names being read have earned the reading. I did not go to the front of the room. I did not wave or gesture. I stood by the column and listened to the remaining 3 names, and when the program ended I walked back to my booth and began disassembling the display. Petra found me there 10 minutes later. She helped me fold the hanging samples and did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "How are you doing?" I said I was fine, which was true, and also that I was very tired, which was also true. 4 days of booth hours and technical conversations, and the sustained performance of professional readiness had cost something I had not fully budgeted for. The tiredness was not unpleasant. It was the specific fatigue of having done the thing you prepared to do. We packed the samples in their carriers. We stacked the boxes. We carried them to the ground floor in 2 trips. The showcase's industry newsletter published the recognition list that same evening as a digital dispatch to its subscriber list of approximately 40,000 contacts in the fashion and textile industry. The article was a paragraph per developer. Mine described the fiber blend, the finishing innovation, and the preliminary supply discussion, and included a photograph that the showcase's documentation team had taken of my booth on the second day, during the hour when Sylvie Bertrand was there. In the photograph, one of the hanging samples was visible behind the work table. The lookbook was open. The swatch display was untouched. I did not know the photograph had been taken. I found out when a former colleague from the import company sent me a message that said simply, "Is this you?" with the newsletter link. I was at a restaurant near the hotel when the messages began arriving. By the time I finished dinner and walked back, there were 19 from people I knew with varying degrees of closeness, and a dozen from people I did not recognize at all. Buyers, a journalist from a trade publication, 2 textile educators, a design student who had found the newsletter through a social media share. I went to sleep at midnight. When I woke up the following morning, 31 calls had come in overnight. The last one, and the only one I recognized from the missed call list before I had coffee, was from my mother's number. I looked at it for a moment. Then I went down to the hotel breakfast and called Petra instead, because Petra was the right first call, and because I wanted to be clear in my own mind about what had happened before I described it to anyone else. I called my mother 4 days after I returned home. I had responded to the industry contacts, completed a second call with Oralee, had an initial technical exchange with Sylvie Bertrand's development team about volume specifications, and had a meeting scheduled with Petra to discuss production planning for the increased capacity I was going to need. I called from my studio, sitting at the work table, with the remaining hanging samples from the Paris trip arranged on the rail behind me. The studio smelled the way it always did in February, cold air from the old window seals, the particular dust and oil smell of the loom, the faint lanolin of the wool I had been sampling the previous month. It was the smell of the place where the work had happened, which was the right place to make the call from. My mother answered on the second ring. She said a friend of the family, a woman named Chisholm, who my mother had known since before I was born, and who worked in a Lagos textile import business and subscribed to European industry publications, had sent her the newsletter article the morning after it published. My mother said Chisholm had sent it with a voice message that said, in Igbo, the approximate equivalent of, "Your daughter is in the Paris fashion news." My mother said, "I called you many times." I said I had seen. She said, "I saw the photograph. The fabric was," she paused. "It looked different in the photograph. Then it looked on the table." I said, "The light was good in the booth." She was quiet for a moment. I heard her sit down. The particular sound of her kitchen chair, the one with the slightly uneven leg that scraped the same way every time. She had been sitting in it my whole life. Then she said, "I dropped it." I said, "I know." Her voice did not change. She did not offer elaboration, and I did not ask for it. The acknowledgement was brief and exact, which was how my mother handled the things she found difficult, not with expansion but with precision. She was not a woman who narrated her own errors at length. She named them and moved. She asked if the Paris arrangement would be stable. I told her I was in supply discussions with a fashion house, that the preliminary figures were in a range I was satisfied with, and that the full contract would take another 2 months to finalize. She asked if Petra was still involved. I said Petra had been the one who made the introduction, and that she remained a useful advisor. My mother said, "This Petra, she saw it." I said she had. My mother said that was good. Then she asked if I would come for a visit once the contract was finalized. I said yes, I would plan for that. Before the call ended, she asked me to greet Petra for her. I said I would. My aunt called 6 days later. She opened with, "I heard the news," which is the sentence people use when they have had enough time to decide how to open. She said she was proud of me. I thanked her. She asked several questions about the showcase, about the fashion house, about whether this was now my full-time work, about whether I had needed to take on any debt to make the Paris trip happen. I answered each one. The debt question I answered honestly. I had received a grant that covered the trip costs, and no, I had not taken on personal debt for the showcase. She said that was wise. She asked about Petra. I said Petra was an advisor and had been the one to make the initial introduction to the Paris buyer. There was a pause. When I finished, I understood she had reached the place in the conversation where the November kitchen was either going to be addressed or passed over. She passed over it. I did not pull it back. I understand why. People do not typically reopen the thing they got wrong once the thing has gone right, not because they have no awareness of it, but because reopening it costs more than they know how to pay in the middle of an ordinary phone call. My aunt had looked at a sample on a kitchen table and made a judgment, and the judgment had been wrong, and she knew it and I knew it, and the knowing was the thing, not the saying. What she had said in November, "Let her fail, then she'll listen," was not cruelty for its own sake. It was fear for a woman she cared about, filtered through a framework that had no category for what I was doing. She had not had Sylvie Bertrand's hands on the cloth for 45 minutes of technical questioning. She had not been in the warehouse studio on the Thursday morning when Petra folded the sample and said she was going to send photographs to someone. The framework was the problem, not my aunt. The supply contract with Sylvie Bertrand's house was finalized in June, 4 months after the showcase. The initial agreement covered a specific run for one collection, a volume I could produce in my current studio with one additional floor loom and a part-time production assistant I hired in May. The contract value was $247,000 for the initial run, with a renewal option for the following season conditional on delivery quality and timeline compliance. I signed in my studio on a Tuesday morning.
Petra witnessed.
My assistant was at the loom, adjusting the warp for the first contract run. I did not photograph the signing. I filed the contract, closed the folder, and asked my assistant if the warp tension was holding. She said it was holding fine. We went back to work.
The studio is larger now.
I moved into a space 3 times the size at the beginning of the following year, still in the same warehouse district, 2 floors above the original room. The north-facing window is bigger. The radiator still ticks for the first 2 hours of every morning because I requested the same unit when I renegotiated the lease. The sound had become part of how I knew the workday had started. Petra and I formalized an advisory arrangement. My assistant became full-time. We have a second loom, acquired from a mill in Portugal that was updating its equipment, in better condition than the first one I ever owned. I visit my parents when I can. My mother has asked twice to see the studio. I have told her I will bring her when the space is set up the way I want it. I mean that. I want her to see the looms running, the hanging samples from the current collection, the work table with the specification sheets in their folders, the second loom from Portugal still wearing its original maker's mark on the frame. I want her to see what the thing became and what it is still becoming. Not to prove anything. Not to replay the November kitchen with better lighting or a different ending. Just because it is something worth seeing, and she is someone I want to see it. What I know now, that I did not know when I was driving home alone in the dark from my parents' kitchen with the sample box on the back seat, is that the doubt of the people closest to you and the value of the thing you are building are completely separate facts. They do not affect each other. The cloth did not become better or worse when my mother dropped it. Petra's assessment did not change based on what my aunt had said the previous weekend. Sylvie Bertrand touched the cloth with hands that had no idea what my family thought, and her hands told her what they told her. The work exists on its own terms. The people who recognize it early are the ones who have the framework to see it. The ones who need external confirmation before they can see it, a newsletter, a photograph, a buyer in Paris, they are not your judges. They are simply later readers of the same text. You do not need the early readers to be your family. You only need them to be right. Go build the thing. Work in the room you can afford. Let the hands that know exactly what they're touching find it when it's ready. The rest follows. Before you go, one question. My mother learned about the Paris announcement from Chisholm's voice message. Before I called, before she called me 31 times, before I picked up. What do you think she did in the time between hearing Chisholm's voice message and making that first call? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. If this story stayed with you, leave a like. It tells me the stories are finding the people who need them. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. I post every week. Thank you for being here.